Okay. Good evening to you all. On behalf of Vikram Sarabhai Library, I welcome you all to the book talk today to be delivered by Professor Kavitha Ranganathan on the book Impactful Visual Data Visualization, Hide and Seek with Graphs. We have with us Professor Minu Agarwal, who will be moderating this session. Minu is a faculty member at SAPT University. She teaches building physics related subject at SAPT. Her research areas were work. Her research, her area of research are work on energy use and indoor environmental quality in buildings. Over to you, Minu.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here. Hello? It is.
Long press, yeah. Yeah, on just hold it for 2 seconds.
Okay. Now, better? No? It's selected.
Yeah.
It's already on? Okay. Good. So thank you very much. Yes, my name is Minu Agarwal and I teach building physics related subjects, and I'm sure some of you are wondering like, what am I doing here? So we will definitely be talking about this book and about the author also. I'm sure many of you know her, but for those who don't know her, Kavitha Ranganathan is a professor here at IIM in the information science area. And she's also a member of the Ravi J. Mathai Center for Education Innovation. And while the rest of us are drowning in data, Kavitha has made friends with data and is happily swimming in it. She teaches several courses in data visualization, along with, of course, her specializations in digital and internet technologies. She has a background in computer science. So as I introduce her, I feel like we are farther and farther away in our domains, but I think data visualization is a subject that connects us all. I'm sitting here. I'm sure anyone in the audience could come here who's read the book, can come and happily discuss this book with Kavitha, because that's a subject that we all deal with as consumers of data. We also produce data visualizations for ourselves, for our audiences. It's something that's around us all the time. Just to tell you a bit more why I'm specifically here to discuss this book, why even I picked up this book. In my domain also, I teach data visualization, not entirely as a subject per se, but yeah, I try and take this on with the students and struggle with it in quite a few occasions. And I will share my struggles with you while I talk about the book. While I was working on my PhD, again, in building science, the research grant that I was working on, that specifically, had a requirement that all my findings have to be shared in a visual form. I have to share all the data that I produce in a visual form. And that just showed to me, and I think reflects upon us, that, this data visualization is, it is one of the most important tools we have to understand the world around us and to share our world with others. So I really am thankful for Kavitha for writing this wonderful book. I must also add that the first time I picked up this book, and as I fanned through the book, I was quite surprised. I think I was expecting maybe more complex, fancy graphs that we see today, which are clearly very difficult to understand. This book, however, you'll find talks a lot about very simple everyday charts that perhaps are our first pass when we try and visualize data. So bar charts, histograms, scatter plots. While in the classroom, I teach, I try and teach data visualization to my students. I've gone through the usual blogs and everything that do talk about the common pitfalls. I was surprised, like, is there stuff still left to be said about these simple charts that anybody can spit out from Excel or other tools like that? And I think that way is the book really served as a mythbuster for me, where I really got to see the nuance behind these simple charts, which I think sometimes are forgotten. We overlook the subtlety that's involved in producing these charts. So I want to share my surprise with everyone here and also ask Kavitha then, how did you choose this as a, topic for this book, where you do, focus on some of the simplest charts and you unpack those for us.
So for me, for someone who has been teaching data visualization for so many years now, it's still always a surprise when I walk into a classroom and I see people struggling even with the simplest of what I think are the simplest of graphs. Right? And so this was my attempt to actually kind of distill whatever learnings I've had over the last 13, 14 years of teaching this subject. And I wanted to concentrate primarily on misleading graphs because that's the topic that always takes the participants by surprise. Whether it's our PGP students or there are people from executive education, this is a topic that always generates a lot of debate. So the people are always surprised that what they have been creating so far could have been misleading. And I realized that there's still a lot to say on that particular topic. So while it starts off as a general book and there's a quick introduction to how you would fit the right graph or the right message, the crux of the book deals with trying to deal with some of these common bloopers that we might intentionally or unintentionally make.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think I really like the format of the book where you discuss many of these bloopers in a sort of question-answer format, where I think the book would help me articulate actually the kind of questions that perhaps were swirling around in my head, but I wasn't even clear what question to ask. So sometimes, if I'm trying to intuitively tell a student that, I think there's something wrong with this figure, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And I think that's where the book really came to my help, where now I can. And I think it really helps you unpack various kinds of figures and helps answer fundamental questions like, okay, what is wrong about it? And why is it wrong?
Yeah.
And I think that's where I just really like the book. Do you think the question and answer sort of format, would you say that was your intention to write it like that? And has it flowed from your classroom?
Right. So I'm so used to, right now I'm like, itching to ask a few questions to the audience. But that's generally how, the classroom interaction works. And I kind of wanted to bring that in the book. I didn't want it to be a passive experience. I wanted the audience to very much be part of the entire process. So instead of just saying this is how you would do something, I want the audience to, sit in a place, look at the graph, think about it, and kind of come up with the solution themselves. So if I say what's wrong with this graph, and I want you to kind of apply your brain a little bit and come up with your own solution. If you're confused, that's a good thing, because that means you've thought about what might be wrong, what might be working, what might not be working, and then go ahead and say this is what the deal is with the graph. I think that's a little more effective than just saying this is why this particular thing doesn't work, right? So if you can figure it out for yourself, you're never going to really go down that path again. So it's also a lot of fun to write it that way.
Yeah, it's almost like a self-help book on how to get better at producing graphs that are beyond the discussion also that in the book. I think another question I had was just regarding the choice of the types of figures that you did choose to discuss. Some of these figures are perhaps even taboo in academic circles, like the pie chart. You talk about the pie chart also. So you can talk a bit about how did you draw the boundary, like, okay, I'm going to talk about this, and this figure.
So I started out with most of the usual suspects. I didn't want to get into some of the more esoteric graphs because most of them, though I look at the entire range in my courses, they're for very niche situations, right? So, and that's typically where you would want to use it. But at least there was like so much to say even about the very basic graphs that I decided just to stick to these. And coming to the pie chart, that's a very interesting point. So a lot of data visualization experts actually hate the pie chart, right? So they will tell you not to use the pie chart, but the pie chart still exists today, right? I'm sure many of you would have used the pie chart in some form or the other. There are multiple reasons why it exists today. And one, of course, is something that I just read about today in terms of our fascination for all things circular, right? So I mentioned that in the book a little bit in terms of we like to look at things that are complete in nature. The counterpoint that I heard about today, or that was actually interestingly a talk on joy, what gives us joy. So if we look at images that are sharp, which are jagged, right, we actually have alarm bells ringing in our head, because in nature, you would typically look at jagged things and think that this is something that's going to harm you, like the horns in a deer or sharp glass, right? Whereas circular things are usually safer. So I was like, aha, maybe that is why we still stick around with pie charts in spite of all the literature that tells us we're not really good at deciphering quantities in pie charts. But I do talk about pie charts because within, as I say in the book, for a certain set of categories, if you have very small, let's say 2, 3, 4 categories, and if you design your pie chart well, that can be a very, very effective construct. And of course, it makes you feel safe.
No sharp edges. I also wanted to share with everyone some of my favorite pages from the book. Do you think we can look at some of them?
Yeah. Oh, you have.
I have. So these are just 3-4 snippets that I pulled out. There's, of course, much more stuff that can be unpacked once you do read the book. So this is a very simple bar chart, and it's also truncated, so it doesn't start from a 0, but rather from an arbitrary number that the person who drew it chose to start with. And again, this is a common no that you hear about bar charts. Like, how can you make a choice where it starts? You have to be truthful, you have to start from a 0. Yes, point taken, but I think until I read the book, I didn't quite know why exactly that is a problem. And then the book talks about, how are we reading this? Without really thinking about it, our mind already starts to process the chart. And there are certain cues that our mind is just, that's how it's programmed to start reading these charts. And so there are different ways that our mind is reading each figure. And that determines whether it will be read truthfully, it will be interpreted correctly or not. So if we look at another example where the book tries to show the various dimensions that our minds read. It can read length, it can read area, it can read color gradients, it can read colors. And so sometimes these choices are made intentionally by the person who makes a chart. Sometimes Excel dictates these choices for us. Sometimes people are not really quite thinking, or could be manipulative as well. So either ways, whatever be the source of, or potential for misinterpretation in each figure, just going down to the basics helps you, prepare better for your, next data plot, like what exactly is wrong with it. I can now point out.
So the point with looking at the 1D, 2D, and 3D versions of objects is our brains are inherently very good at assessing differences if we look at it in 1D. So that's what a bar graph does for you, right? So your information is in 1D because the thickness is not really encoding any quantity. That's just there to give some visual weight. I incidentally struggled quite a bit to get this particular picture right for my book, because all of these graphs that you see are things that I created from scratch. And the takeaway here is that, of course, there's a bit of an aspect ratio change that the projector is doing. These are supposed to be circles in the book. They're circles, and you'll see them as ovals here. Imagine them as circles. So bars, circles, and spheres. Right? So 1D, 2D, and 3D. And we definitely are not, our brains are not configured to judge ratios when they are presented as areas. We're not as good as in 1D. And it gets worse with 3D, right? We intentionally we land up underestimating when we look at 3D. So the whole point of this, and of course, I ask you to do this exercise in the book before you see the answer, is can you judge the ratios of the two bars? And the ratios of the two bars, so one is 3 and one is 4. So there's a ratio is 3:4, right? One is 3/4 the other. And so is the ratio. It's the same ratio for the circles, and it's the same ratio for the spheres. The smaller one is always a 3:4 ratio. And that's not very apparent when you initially make that guess. So this just translates to your choice of what graph you use. So given a choice, stick to a 1D construct. What is a 2D construct? A pie chart would be a 2D construct. A bubble chart where you have circles would be 2D constructs, right? So almost immediately you are making the choice or making the decision much more difficult for your audience to accurately judge the ratios. And 3D, of course, makes it even worse. So you will see a lot of objects that are being used to represent data. And it's very common today. If you pick up any magazine, any newspaper, you will see 3D objects. Excel that we spoke about has all these 3D objects where you can very nicely create a cone, create any kind of fancy 3D object. But again, that is very, very difficult for your audience to actually make sense of. So why go for a 2D or a 3D construct if you can use a 1D construct was the point of this particular image. But why I struggled with it is I had to do a lot of back calculations to get the ratio for those spheres exactly right. The volume had to be 3:4, right? So that was a little bit time consuming to create that.
Right. Thank you for unpacking that for us again. Maybe just one more example here. This is a simple example like about deciding the aspect ratio of a figure. Honestly, this is something I never thought about. I was just like, okay, what is my page width? And is it a 2-column paper or single column? And that what decides the aspect ratio for me. So these are many, dimensions of charts that come out once you just have a moment to think about, okay, what are we doing here and what's happening to the audience with what I'm doing here.
Right. And very often we come to a graph with a message already. I want to show that, for example, your sales are plummeting. How do I go about creating a graph that is going to get that message across, right? So while it's tempting to do that, we also have a responsibility as the creator of that graph to be true to whatever underlying data is. And as a creator, we know what the truth is. So it's just me nudging you to double think that little bit of urge to change the aspect ratio. And of course, if you're on the other side, if you're an audience and you're looking at a graph that looks really stretched out, like the third one, or a graph that is really narrow and tall, you can actually call out whoever's presenting that graph, and because now you know that the aspect ratio has probably been tampered with, right? And it happens all over. It's something that we might consciously or unconsciously do. So I just want to bring this information out to everybody's conscious part of the brain.
Right. I think that the later half of the book does begin to reach into, okay, what is your message? And how do you pass that on to the audience without it being open for misinterpretation?
Right.
And last but not the least, the pie chart, where there's a right way to do it, and where actually pie chart can actually do a better job than, say, a bar chart, if drawn correctly. I think I'll leave it to you to read the book and discover what exactly is the big tip here. So if we continue to unpack the book a little more, Kavitha, you mentioned your struggles with, really preparing figures from scratch that pass on the message and, bring out, for example, these subtle differences between 1D versus 2D. I think this book is a lot about subtlety. If you appreciate subtlety, then this is definitely a book for you. Do you think you had any roadblocks or the proverbial writer's block while preparing the book?
I did. So this book was actually written in bits and pieces. It took quite a while to write the book because I would chip away at a particular chapter. And then, of course, this was during the pandemic. So there were all of the additional stuff that was happening all over. So it was, and I also got stuck at some point because I was like, who is my audience? Right? So essentially, if I have everybody in mind, my communication wasn't really flowing. So I had to figure out a particular kind of person I was writing the book for, somebody who deals with data, but somebody who probably just takes the data and puts it into Excel or any other tool and creates a default graph, not really understanding why that graph is there. Right? So once I had that particular audience in mind, and of course, a non-judgmental audience, so anybody who's trying to write something, picture somebody who's non-judgmental, and then the book will flow. If you keep thinking of everybody who's going to judge it, which was where I got stuck initially. So that helped. And once I had that in mind, of course, and it was a lot of fun, I must say. I had a blast writing this book. So it's out there, but the reward is already in the fun I had writing it.
Right. I quite enjoyed reading it too. I think your fun was showing in the book. You mentioned Excel, which I think is a tool that, many of us are still using it every day. Do you think and since you have been teaching this subject for quite a few years, do you think these tools have gotten better at catching up with things that you are saying in the book, or are they still leaving it all on the users?
So some tools are still allowing you to create. So for example, the first example that we talked about, the truncated bar graph, there is no possible reason why anybody at any point in time would actually need to use such a bar graph, because under any circumstances, and this is an open point, if you find a case for a truncated bar graph, please let me know. I'd like to have a discussion with you because I can't. So there's no real reason why a tool should even allow you to do that. And responsible tools, in fact, don't allow you to create truncated bar graphs, right? So even though Excel does, there's a host of other tools, for example, Tableau, which will not even allow you to create a truncated bar graph. So definitely some of the tools have gotten much better, but there are a lot of tools that still allow you to create a lot of these misleading graphs. And I don't know why, but they're still there.
So I think that's where as I guess as producers, consumers of it's still our job somewhat.
Yes, it's definitely our job. We can't leave it up to the tool,
Yeah.
right? And also in terms of the message that you want to show.
True.
In today's world, of course, the big question in the community is, are we redundant now because of AI, right? So AI is going to create your graph for you. Do we really need to learn data visualization? Yes, we do, because AI is also just a tool. At least I've tried very hard to use the existing AI tools to create good graphs and have not succeeded. At the end of the day, the onus is still on you to then tell the tool exactly what to do. If you're really good at communicating that, then the tool will create something half decent for you. But that's still, you can't wish away the human in the equation. It's you who knows what needs to be created at the end of the day, even if it's AI. So definitely there's a lot to understand. And if you understand the art and science behind data visualization, it's like a whole new world opens up. So my wish is, if you read my book, let this be just a launch pad to the wonderful world of data visualization that is out there, because it's a mix between, it has elements of communication, it has elements of psychology, it has elements of neuroscience, it has elements of design. It's all of these wonderful things that come together to create that one perfect graph.
Beautiful. I mean, speaking of where we are headed with technology and helping us graphs and data visualizations that, speak for us. Interactive charts are also becoming quite popular. They do give the audience the flexibility and perhaps that richness where you get to interact with graphs. You also mentioned some of them in the book. Talk about flickering charts where motion, movement, change, this is something that immediately attracts the eye. And so that can be another dimension of a figure. Do you think over time or today, what is the space for static charts? Do you think they could go away after a while, that we may not need these static charts?
So animated charts look good. But there are, again, a very small number of scenarios where they can actually be effective. Just because our cognition is limited, the human cognition is limited. So if you have things moving very fast, your brain is really not going to be able to process and get some key messages. So there are niche situations where, for example, an animated bubble chart, the Hans Rosling famous chart, it looks wonderful, right, and it can be used as an icebreaker. So if your audience is going to sleep, you get some animation going, you get those flickering colors, they will wake up. But for insights, you still need to, you will see people even pausing that animation to actually get the insights at different points in time. Right? Yeah. And that is the best kind of animation that is possible.
Can pause. Yeah.
For no, the best kind of animation is the one in the Hans Rosling chart. That's the best animation graph out there. Others are much worse, right? So there's definitely a limit to how much you can do with animations. But interactive graphs, yes, there are tools today that allow you to dig in, to get your own answers out, and that is invaluable because everybody can actually go in, look at the graph and then figure out which particular dimension they want to look at further, what kind of investigative question they want to answer for themselves. Mm-hmm. And there are tools out there that do it beautifully, right? But for all of those situations, again, what I talk about in the book holds in terms of how do you create, what are the structures that are going to be effective for different situations, and then you can dig in with different dimensions, different filters to get answers out.
Yeah, I do agree that they're fun sometimes, but and not so informative. And yeah, there are limits to how much data you can process, especially something that's outside your domain, for example.
Right.
To process that kind of information, I think such charts are the best place to begin. So if you're speaking to unfamiliar audiences, I think this is still perhaps
your
the best tool.
Bet,
yes. Right. Cool. I have more questions, but I think if we have anybody from the audience who has questions, so I don't eat up the whole time.
Do you have a folder in your computer now with bad graphs? I'm sure people are sending you a lot of poorly drawn graphs.
I have a whole PPT because that's what I use for my class, bad graphs.
My other question, main question is, I feel like academics who have understanding of data are the biggest offenders of, especially our journals are populated with this kind of graphs and all. So I feel with knowledge, actually, people are misusing it rather than, is there like, I don't know, in your investigation, did that really work? Or is it that people really lack knowledge?
There are both kinds, right? So there are certain graphs where it's a mistake. So somebody has created that graph and inadvertently, not realizing that it is going to give, it's not true to the data, right? But then there are other graphs where you can very clearly see that the manipulation has been done for a particular message, and they come with an agenda, right? So of course, and there are plenty of both. Sometimes it's difficult to figure out whether it was honest mistake or not, and you always want to give them the benefit of doubt, but in certain cases it's very obvious. And of course, in my book I talk about a lot of and I leave it up to you, I leave it up to the audience. I am not passing judgment on any of these graphs, but at the very least they are misleading. That much we can establish.
One of the moments when I saw the comparison between 1D, 2D, and 3D graph, it's extremely insightful to realize the power of visual communication. But on a lighter note, do you think we also need ethical activism by communication experts like to stop doing that? Because many people can get ideas on how to manipulate the more informed they are after reading the book.
So that's also something I get at the end of my class when I teach this session on misleading graphs. A lot of people now have shiny eyes. They're like, now we know how to present our stuff to our boss because, now I know how to dress up the data in the right way. So I actually then give them an exercise where I give them certain scenarios and I tell them to create misleading graphs. I say, get it out of your system. Right here in this graph. Once you step out, you're not doing this. But right now you have the power, do what you want. And it's a fun session. They go about creating all these misleading graphs and having a good laugh. And then hopefully after that, it's out of their system. I'm sure it's not. But at the end of the day, these are tools. As I say, it's a tool that you can use whichever way you want. And my goal in writing this book is to make this knowledge so common that the next time you see a misleading graph or somebody is trying to use it, there'll be enough people standing up in the room and saying, hey, wait a second, we know what you're trying to do, right? So that's it won't be secret anymore. It won't be the domain of a select few who can actually try these tricks. Oh, this
But data visualization is almost very intuitive. But also there's on the other side, there's no one size fits all scenarios or case. So my question is, when for somebody who's starting out, it's not very intuitive. It's much more complex than it seems. It's not as simple. So how does one sort of navigate through various different scenarios and try to create visualizations for all of them?
Practice, right? I can sit here and confidently tell you some things about the subject and claim to be, I won't claim to be an expert, but to have some knowledge about the subject because I've spent, I think, 15 years just doing this. And now it's become quite intuitive to me and I can say, oh, this is quite obvious. But obviously, at one point, it wasn't intuitive to me as well. If I go back to my research papers, which I created as a grad student, I can't show you those graphs. I have truncated bar graphs and I didn't know they were supposed to be misleading, right? I had no clue. Excel created it and I put them out there. And if I talk about the top 5 mistakes, I think I've created all of them. And this was before I started reading up and understanding data visualization and practicing. So a great thing to do is once you learn the theory, once you have access to a book and you've read the stuff, start picking up your older graphs, things you've created in the past, and start critiquing them. And then one by one, you will chop away at all of those usual mistakes that you were making. And that's a starting point. Okay? And then, of course, grab every opportunity to create a new visual. And that helps.
This is a general question. I think now there are a lot of softwares like this Tableau or BI. So people have started using them quite a lot. So with this, you get a lot of fancy graphs. So how that has impacted the overall scenario of presentation at first?
So, as I said, the fancier graphs than the very basic graphs that we're talking about, a lot of them are useful for very niche scenarios, for a very special case. As we have multiple dimensions. For example, let's pick up a graph that you don't see very often, which is the Marimico chart, right? So Marimico chart is also called the tree map. I briefly mentioned that in the book, but you won't see too many examples using that because one, it represents information in 2D. So have you seen these squares within squares and colorful squares? They are called Marimico charts or tree maps. And the reason they were only created initially to understand how the contents of a hard drive were mapped out. So you have folders within folders within folders. And so whenever you have hierarchical information, that's a great way to represent data. But if you don't have hierarchical information, you're just creating a very confusing graph for information that could have been put out much more simply. So most of these are for those specialized cases. And if you know that, then the power is with you to use it for the right situation.
We are showing these graphs. This one you said there is no reason why you should make it a very bad.
Right.
And one thing in many of these examples, really nice examples, and try to read your book, but I'm wondering whether something is misleading or not. Maybe a function of also the context in which you are sort of. For example, in this case, as hypothetically, if you consider that 16 mg is a sort of safe level of nicotine in cigarettes, right? Now, do you think that this is a reasonable, like I'm saying that 16 is a standard? The science tells me that up to 16 there are no risk of sort of having nicotine in your cigarette. Now I'm sort of trying to show how my nicotine levels vary to my. And similarly, in that different aspect ratios, right? Again, what you want to communicate there is a function of the creator's sense of, there's a context to, there could be situations where it's actually a very steep fall.
Yes.
Right? Depending on the context of what is being shown, right? Whereas in other cases, it may be sort of more regular kind of a reduction in that, right? So I think I'm just struggling with it.
Right.
How do we sort of think of it without sort of, it's not like black and white, something is misleading and
definitely
something is not. It's so much dependent on the context.
Right.
And there is a sort of information asymmetry between the creator and the audience, right?
True.
In terms of the context in which it is created.
So we'll take it one graph at a time, right? So this graph. So when we talk about a bar graph, right? And so this is what I explain in the book. If we have a situation like this, what would be the alternate way? So I just don't talk about what not to do, but I tell you how to actually present that in the truthful way. So for example, if you use a bar graph in any situation, what we're claiming with the bar graph is that the lengths of the bars are true to the quantities that they represent, the ratios. That's what we're claiming when we create a bar graph. And that's not true, right? If we say, okay, this 16 mg is the benchmark and I want to show how much is more and how much is less, we can use a deviation bar graph for that. That can become your standard. And then you don't really need to start from zero. The other thing you can do here is you can use dots. If you use dots instead of bars, again, we're not claiming that the length or the height means anything. It's just the position. But when you're talking about an object in a bar graph, you're saying that the ratios represent quantities, and then of course it becomes misleading because that's what the audience is assuming as well. Whereas for line charts, you don't really need to follow that, because in a line chart, you're not claiming that the length of a point in the line to your axis actually has any meaning. In that case, of course, what you want to show is you want to show an overall trend, and very often starting at 0 will not really allow you to show that trend, which is why there are exceptions. Not all axes need to start at 0, but for a bar graph, definitely. Right? And coming back to what was your second example? Oh, the axis ratios, right? So the axis ratios, yes, we as creators of a graph, we do have some leeway in terms of how much we want to do. But sometimes you will see it's like a rubber band that you can stretch to a certain extent. But if it goes beyond the kind of stretch that you can do can be extreme, right? And then you can actually see that this is trying to push the limits of what you're allowed to do in the bar graph. So that plummeting that you saw, this was just to alert you to the situation that the same data can look so different depending on how you have actually created it. At the end of the day, you can only pray that the person creating the graph has the right intent. Right?
Kavitha, do you think some of these problems will be solved if we put confidence intervals, or does it solve? Does it? I mean, does it solve the problem? And why does it not solve the problem?
Definitely not here, right? The confidence interval is still going to just tell you that this is the range within which you will find this data, but it still doesn't, in the previous one, the bar graph, it doesn't really help you understand the actual ratios. That's the basic data. So confidence intervals help in certain situations, but they don't make up for a misleading graph. Definitely not. I have an interesting example which I'll show later in terms of a graph. Maybe we should just bring that up now. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I couldn't resist this. This was a graph that came up earlier this month. It made a lot of headlines on Twitter. This was actually put up by quite a well-known economist. And the message being conveyed in this graph was that you can see this is the sample size is wrong. Major surveys that policymakers rely on are actually not true to the base data, right? So what the point of this article was that, can you see the blue bars? So the point was that estimation from the survey is what you have is the red dots. So the point trying to be made here in this graph is that the red dots are very far from the actual data, which is the blue graphs, the blue bars. Let's see how far away they are, and hence all our surveys are completely useless. Now I'll put this up to you. Can you figure out what is wrong with this graph? There are multiple things, multiple ways in which this graph actually has been changed from the default that a software will give you to get the red dots further away from the blue bars, or to make you think that the difference is vastly exaggerating the difference between those two data sets. It's truncated. First thing is it starts at 65%. 65%. So essentially, it's not more than 2 or 3 percentage points, the difference between the two data sets, 2 to 3 percentage points. But if you looked at this, you'd be like, oh my God, our surveys are crazy. Look at the disparity between the actual data and the surveys. That's point number one. Can you figure out what else is wrong?
These confidence intervals, then it looks like it's different, no?
Right. So the second point is these are supposed to look like confidence intervals, but they're actually not. There's just decoration there. Right? And there's a third thing that's wrong with this.
Type of marker used.
Yes. And you might think that these are confidence intervals. They're not.
This is the same, almost the same in all the cases. How the offset
There's a subtle, very subtle manipulation done here, which you may not notice. Look at the scale. It's 65, 68, 70, 73. So it's the gaps are not uniform to the advantage of the message in the article, because what has happened, 68 to 70 instead of 73. So that part has been stretched out, which means there's a further gap now created between the red dots and the ends of the bars. And no software will create this for you. So Akshaya, where did Akshaya run away? So coming back to her question, can you say some graphs have been manipulated, or would you say this is an honest mistake? Again, I will leave it up to you. Right? It's for you to judge.
That also means one thing that a visualization should always give only JPEG images to be published, so that if someone is sketching it on the PowerPoint, it's clearly visible on the text.
Yes.
Never give better data to someone who's going to publish it from that.
Possibly, yes. But in this case, it's not the access ratio that has been changed, right? It's the actual data. So even if I were to manipulate this, it wouldn't change the base of what has been done by whoever created this graph.
You said that this visualization is an art and science. So I was wondering, this would take what Dr. Sam would say, that how really important is it to know all the tools to produce the visualization? You can be aware of the various tools and know what they create, and you can know for what kind of graph can be used, and it's more effective, like perhaps reading your books and some other experiences. And you know that there's a creator who can do this for you. So how important is it for us to know that?
So tools are always secondary, because once you know what you want to do and how you want to do it, almost any tool will allow you to create it. So for example, all the graphs in my book have been created using Excel, nothing more than Excel. Excel's defaults are horrendous. They can give you very bad graphs if you just use the defaults. But the good thing with Excel is you get 100% flexibility also. So you can go ahead and really change that graph into exactly how you want it to look. So at the end of the day, I'm not a big fan of very fancy tools. Whatever tool you have access to, if you understand what you're doing and why you want to do something, the tool, you can use the tool to your advantage.
We need an international standard for graphs.
I think so.
Given that one potential on this.
Yeah, this graph meets ISO.
What Kavitha is saying, and I think the message is very clear, that you need a graph in the market. And if you do not have that adequate knowledge, you can be misled.
Right.
So having some kind of a standard which will ensure that graphs are truthfully portrayed.
Yeah, that would be a great initiative to have something like that. So at least some of the basic concerns are taken away when you are actually trying to make sense of a graph.
I don't know which article this is from, but a lot of discussion happened after it. So I follow some of those, but nobody discussed this about the misleading of graph.
So
Everybody discussed this data collection framework. I don't know if you have come across. So
there were a couple of people who pointed out, these things.
So now that I realize those standard errors are regulations.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can look at them now.
It does not match,
Right.
with the marker.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. So there's certain assumptions you would make, and then you need, and the scale, you actually need a magnifying glass. It's so subtle, but so clever.
Yeah, you're flipping through a newspaper in the morning. I'm not sure if all of us will be paying that much attention without.
I think
Right.
one is a little bit what you were saying about the context and all, getting kind of lost, because most people look at the visual as a communication in itself, although the context may be verbally there.
Oh, in this case, the context was also very much. Yes.
The other ones where, of course, if the person is going to be explaining it. And
Right.
visual is part of something else, where the verbal content will show you how, whether that starting at 16 was in any way justified, what is the person's logic for even doing that. Perhaps that setting of the context may happen. I think the worry that I'm picking up is that most of us, and especially if we are less aware, therefore we are less likely to be critically looking at it, are going to take away the meaning very largely from the visual
Right.
itself,
Yes.
not factor in the context, which may sort of give a pass to the person.
Right. And that's the biggest danger, right? Because the graph is so much more attractive than the text. And given our attention spans, you see an article, right? You see that, and that's the message you'll go away with.
Might not even go through the rest of the context.
Right. Yes.
It lingers longer in the mind, in the memory, and has that impact.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Definitely.
think the worry is more of that.
Yes.
And about the activism, somebody asked, I think this is that very slow activism that books like this do. Because as scholars and academics, we're not doing the actual activism, but how many people we can put this in the minds of, who can then in turn, because when people ask you, oh, I can now trick my boss, well, the boss will come to the program next year. People will get sort of familiarized with that.
Right.
And so on and so forth. So it's a slow and,
Right.
trickle down or trickle up.
Yeah. So you got that exactly right. So I was panicking at some point, because even after 10 or 12 iterations of so many years of teaching this, I would still go back and the participants would still argue about a truncated paragraph. And it's like, how many times am I going to do this? And how many classes can I teach? Right. So my attempt with the book is, of course, it's not that this information is not there in other visualization books, but most of them are very expensive. Right? So I wanted to distill it all into a form that anybody can pick up and read. And of course, my youngest reader, he's not here today, but his mom is here, is a 13-year-old. He picked up the book and he understood it from the beginning to the end. And that was my biggest compliment, that, I've managed to put it in a way that everybody can pick it up and everybody can get the essence of what I'm trying to communicate.
You're really catching them young.
My younger one and we sat together, and the way the book is written, question and answer. So we try to answer the questions, and then we will discuss, okay, what was your answer? And then eventually we will read the next chapter or the answer. So I like the book, the way it's written is really easy. And I think I am a representative of a common man, not the professor, not the library staff, which were giving almost daily data, or not the student who are, going to use this things. But as a housewife and as a common man, this is really nice. Few things which I really learned, and few I was okay. So here is that like something to more read about, or something which I was not aware of. But this nicotine and other drugs, I was aware of. So this is how this marketing business. So wonderful job, and thanks a lot, because even we people can understand. I wanted to say about an environment and I was talking concerned, but I'm going to use this looking at somebody says my research is subjective and biased. I think like after 10 years, I have some tool. I think in class, quantitative research is considered to be that epitome of non-biased objective. So thanks for this. I'm going to have very
All sorts of applications we're finding in the book today.
But the role of colors, let's say, apart from the job issues, why I'm coming to this point is I saw a pie chart from a leading television channel, news channel, and they flipped the red and green. So they wanted to show that how bad the current situation is. but they use red to show the green aspect and the green to show the red aspect. So, the importance of using color as another visual element. Are there any kind of thoughts on that direction? Or can color also add a tone of
So there's a little bit of that in my book, but interesting that you bring it up because that's the current book I'm working on the use of color in data visualization, because there's your choice of colors can make or break a particular graph. So again, that's exactly, a very important point is what are the emotions associated with color? What are some of the meanings we associate with color? What are the cultural implications of using a particular color for a particular audience? So that's something that I'm intensely interested in. And some of that is there in the book just as a starting point. But of course, my goal is to find out more and then write more about it.
Can you talk a little bit more about the process of writing the book? Because I think there are people who are already writing books, but people like us who are struggling to write books. Is there anything that one or two things that you would say that would help finish books?
So, three things that definitely helped me. One is commit to the book, commit externally to the book. So I had told my friends I'm writing a book. I had told my family I'm writing a book. Of course, my husband knew I was writing a book. So I would get hounded. So if I stopped writing, my friends would be like, how's your book going? And I would like, oh my God, I better sit and start writing. So I had actually committed externally to people. You can tell me you're writing a book, now I know. And so because we have so much on our plate, right? You start teaching a course, you do the grading, you do something else, and then you forget. So you have external people reminding you and supporting you. That's a big help. Second thing is something that helped me is write every day. Even if it's just 3 sentences, do that writing every day. 5 minutes, 10 minutes is fine. But then you keep the process growing. It doesn't, get lost somewhere. And the third thing that really helped me is when you stop writing for that day, put in a little blurb for your future self who's going to come back, so that your future self knows where to pick up and continue. Because you will lose you might have 3 things you wanted to write, but when you come back, you'll forget. So that little bit of nudge for when you come back, or these are the next things you wanted to do, and highlight that in some way. So when you open your document, you know exactly, and you don't have that context switch. It's a shorter process there. So these 3 things finally helped me finish my book, because it had been going on for a long time as well. Getting a dog, yes. That helped. Maybe.
Okay, I'm getting one tomorrow.
Kavitha, I have a question. This is largely because of one case that is there in the section that I'm reading. How do you communicate graphs to a visually challenged person? The word says visualization, so I understand. But suppose you want to convey the feeling of a graph. Is it possible? Have you seen any difference here?
I haven't. I've struggled with this as well, because I've had students take up data visualization, but they had partial sight. And a lot of students who are, of course, 10% of our population, male population, is colorblind, right? So that's very common. So of course, then you have to create graphs that are friendly to people who typically cannot distinguish between red and green, because that's very, very common. If we start using that in our categories, then it won't work for a large section of the population. But for somebody who cannot see at all, I have been struggling with this question as well, because sometimes I feel guilty. I'm offering an elective that some people cannot take. How do I teach that to somebody who can't see at all? But I'm stuck. If you get to know something, you should let me know.
That question was posed to me. How do you make that? I thought that you are the right person.
I definitely try to do some more work on this, because it has been on the back of my mind also for a while.
existing visualizations, how to get them across to a student or to create stuff for them. It's just
Does he allocation, so he doesn't know what is the part.
I get that, yeah.
How do you communicate?
Does grade have something wrong?
I mean, you can think of objects maybe that you can feel, but that would still be very limited in terms of being able to create that, right? But definitely something to investigate further.
Yes, nice. I know economics have a lot of graphs, so, and they have actually made.
Physical.
That does make sense.
Might be, but I don't know, I discussed that with this person. The person feeling is that they tried something back, even that in terms of that. Because since I think particularly when you have to differentiate, the differences is very small. Yeah, it becomes really difficult to get that.
Right. So visually, when it is difficult with, the sense of touch, it must be like.
Yeah, that's what is person.
Right.
Audio might know what the graphs is very important.
Right. How do you visually describe something? Yeah.
You communicate enough in a verbal form. Here's challenging.
You can convey the figure of what, but you can only summarize and give a gist of it.
Right. The overall message. Right. Yeah.
The basic started by the.
Convey the message of what you're trying to show, like what is the overall message of the figures in the graph, and you can give some top level numbers to help them understand what the graph is communicating, but we cannot actually make them visualize the graph like we would.
I think, yeah, the audience kind of really jumped in here, and I'm sure there are people who would definitely be reaching out. Yeah, my question was, yeah, what's coming next? I'm now very eager to see. But I think in terms of, apart from the color aspect, I think the book unpacks it beautifully, like just this bar chart we were talking about. Sorry, I flipped out of the thing. She really, in each figure you will find so many versions of, taking it wrong in the wrong direction and how to bring yourself back to make it better. So definitely.
And I also have a pop quiz at the end of the book. So after you read the book, you can take that quiz.
You just can't help it.
Yes.
So question for you, Kavitha. Do you like mirchi pakoda?
Yes, definitely. Perfect season for mirchi pakoda.
Anything else, everyone?
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kavitha and Professor Minu, for taking us through this fantastic book in impactful data visualization. I hope we have a lot of things to take from here. Book is also on display in front of the auditorium. So if you need, you can buy it from there. As a token of memorabilia, I think I'll just ask to hand over this thing to. Okay, join us for tea outside.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for your participation.